All right, this is the second installment of this course of lectures about thought as word dynamics. First thing I'll do is to make a little presentation. I made a presentation about the context. That was the first lecture. Here, within the text itself, I got a short presentation explaining the context. The model presented here has been built over a number of years from several angles. It is truly multidisciplinary in its concept, as the evidence which has been gathered to support its plausibility has 5 main components. I'm going to read the 5 components and then I'll explain a bit more. First, mathematical objects that have been explored by the author in another context as part of his anthropological research on modeling kinship networks and so-called primitive mentality, between inverted commas, types of reasoning, also called rationality, between inverted commas, issues. 2, intensive and extensive logic, the field of logic, the discipline of logic. 3, linguistics. 4, psychology, including Freudian metapsychology. 5, the introspective part of philosophy that amounts to 25 centuries of speculative cognitive science. So the sources for this reflection of thought as word dynamics that was implemented, I'll say a bit more about that later on, was implemented as a piece of software, are 5. The first one, anthropological issues that I worked on, I'm referring to when Sir Edmund Leach, who was my professor at the time, asked one of his graduate students, which was me, to come and help him solve some problems within kinship studies, and in particular some that implied some algebraic approach to issues. I started doing that, and in the process I developed a piece of software that made it possible to analyze automatically genealogies in order to show which kin had married each other in an automated process that had not been done before. I got the help of Elaine Lally as a young mathematician, and together we got a Nuffield Foundation grant in order to do that job. Once I had that method, I had ideas later on how to apply the same methodology in artificial intelligence. The other issue I mentioned about anthropology is the following, is that I was tempted to deal with what are regarded as phenomena of a primitive mentality, between inverted commas, things that people in the West essentially did not understand about how other people were reasoning. And I was trying to model that first in Lisp, which got me nowhere, then in Prolog, and I realized that there were some implications in the way that when we develop programming languages, introduce some view about logic, which is not necessarily the same as other people. And that led me to that reflection that made me possible to go back to a famous issue in anthropology called totemism, and I believe elucidate it once and for all. Second source I mentioned is logic, as I mentioned when I was reading it, logic as we understand it. First, Aristotelian logic, and then the mathematical developments later on when logic was formalized, starting with the work by Boole at the end of the 19th century. Third source, linguistics, under all its forms, but more particularly, I went back to the sources of linguistics by looking in detail, as you will see, into medieval logic. It was attending a lecture by Roman Jacobson in the early 70s at La Sorbonne in Paris, when I heard that famous linguist at some point with a sigh saying the following: there will be so many years still before we get back to the level of sophistication in the study of linguistics that was that of the people of the school, the medieval scholars who were developing linguistics, which is far beyond what we're using now. I got intrigued. I got back to that. I went to the text. At some point, I got a book. I was convinced that was the book that was giving me the solution to a number of issues, and it did. It was at the library in Central Library in Cambridge, and there was that book brought to me called Syntagmata, and I opened it and I realized that it was in Latin because it had never been translated into anything, any current language. After a pause, I decided that because I had studied for 6 years Latin at school, that maybe I should have a go and try to understand what was written there. And fortunately, in that, 14th century manuscript, the Latin, which was used, already had the syntactic form of current languages, and it was not impossible to understand, because if it had the still the syntax of the Roman times Latin, it would have been much more difficult. But there we were, and so I'd followed the advice of Jacobson. I'd gone back to the early text, and indeed, if you look at the theory of supposition, the reflection about the complexes significabile, you realize that the linguistic that had been developed and nearly entirely forgotten, or if not forgotten, because you find it some books of history, not used at all. And what I did then in 1989, when I wrote the book Principes des systèmes intelligents in French, is that I used systematically the knowledge of the scholars of the 13th, 14th century, which is indeed, as Jacobson had said, way beyond in terms of sophistication of what is used currently, and particularly when I see some reflections about the large language models, and people say, well, you know, on one side you have the form, and the other you have the content, or you have, you know, that notion from de Saussure, signified and signifier. These are tools which are so blunt that they are in no use if you want to have a linguistic reflection within the current field of artificial intelligence. Another source I mentioned, number 4, is psychology, and I say in particular the meta-psychology that Freud has developed. There again, it's not the mainstream type of psychology which is the most useful. It is the indeed knowledge which has been created first by Sigmund Freud himself, and then developed further by some followers. That reflection on human beings can be directly implemented when you do artificial intelligence. And I had the surprise the other day asking a question to ChatGPT. I said, you know, how do you represent these things? And the machine, I was about to say he or she, the machine reinvented, really, in the presentation, I would say unaware that it was, because it was not quotations from the literature, from psychoanalysis. It was not that at all that was reproduced by ChatGPT. It was a new reasoning from the knowledge it got from its pre-training, and I was so surprised. It was a reasoning which was pure psychoanalysis and nothing at all from cognitive sciences. A process very parallel to me, that when ChatGPT reinvents linguistics, and in particular because it is part of its own infrastructure as a transformer, there's no mention at all of degenerative or transformational linguistics that was developed painfully by Chomsky over a whole career. It was something entirely different, and in my view, much closer to what I decided to study under the advice of Jacobson, much closer to what the medieval scholars had already discovered, and that for some reason current linguistics totally ignore. It is pure ignorance in my view. And I hope that with these lectures, one of the things I could do is revive interest indeed in those things, in that particular type of approach. Psychology, and I mentioned as number 5, the introspective part of philosophy that amounts to 25 centuries of speculative cognitive science. Philosophy is, I call it speculative cognitive science. It is nothing of that type that we call philosophy has been developed in an experimental kind of environment. It has not been developed in lab, but these 25 centuries of reflections are not nothing at all. There's a number of things. The reflection on how the human mind operates has been done by these 25 centuries of thinkers. When I say 25, because I start with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. 25 centuries of reflection of what is man in the sense of humankind, as an animal that thinks. And this has not been a waste of time at all. If you look at some philosophical influences in what I'm saying, you will see a major influence of another Cambridge man, Wittgenstein. Of course, like myself, he didn't start in Cambridge, he ended up there. But Wittgenstein is one of these people who tried to restart from scratch a reflection about what is the human mind, and I think did a perfect job. Final part of that initial presentation. The ambition here is to provide a framework for speech acts, being specific enough about its statics and dynamics that it is testable as an artificial intelligence application, i.e. can be written as source code. The test began many years ago when, being part of British Telecom's Connex project, I designed ANELLA, an associative network with emergent logic and learning abilities, from 1987 to 1990. The project has been revived lately as ANELLA number 2. Both will be alluded to in the pages to come. Revived in 2021. So much for the second installment. Thank you for having listened to me until now. Bye.